So I'm going to talk about my OG client, Plants of the Gods. It's the podcast that is hosted by renowned ethnobotanist, Dr. Mark J. Plotkin. And we hit 1 million downloads this summer. 1 million. So that is the great news. It's pretty amazing. So the podcast is something that we started in 2020 when we were all on lockdown. And Dr. Plotkin, he actually wrote a book that year, and because everybody was on lockdown, he couldn't go on a book tour. So we decided to do a book launch, a virtual book launch for him. And he decided to launch the podcast. So the podcast, in case for those of you who don't know, an ethnobotanist is a scientist who studies plants of the regions, and Dr. Plotkin is also the founder and president of the Amazon Conservation Team. So they do a lot of work with the indigenous community in the Amazon rainforest, and they've been around. It's a nonprofit that's been around for close to 30 years, but he's been in the field for over 4 decades. So he is the old school. I like to call him the expert on the rainforest right now. He is amazing. And he has a following that came with the podcast. So that's one of the things that was really great about him as a thought leader. He already had people. So the podcast deals with alternative therapies, plant-based healing, and the environment. And before I met Dr. Plotkin, I knew nothing about ayahuasca, marijuana, magic mushrooms, or shamanism. So a lot of the podcasts deal with the topics of shamanism and how you use shamans in the ayahuasca when you're taking these herbal medicines. So there is a following, a niche audience that has been around that came with the podcast, and they helped to grow it. They listen to us bi-weekly, and they've definitely brought the podcast to where it is now. So if you don't know what a shaman is, it's a medicine man. It's a medicine man who knows the medicine, the plants of the region, and that's why it's important to have the shaman there when you're going to partake in any of these medicines of the rainforest. And so Dr. Plotkin has, like I said, knowledge beyond, but he also has friends and acquaintances and colleagues who work in this field who have also brought their knowledge to the podcast. So that's been really helpful. The evolution of the podcast has been really interesting. So that's what I want to talk about too, because when we first started in 2020, Dr. Plotkin wanted to be the solo host of the podcast because, like I said, he's a wealth of knowledge, and to find someone to keep up with him was pretty difficult. And I knew that he could handle the 30-minute podcast, but I wanted him to have guests. And for him, he wanted to do it himself. And it worked great, but it's a lot of work to put it together. And we did that for a short while where he was the main host. We live streamed. Live stream was very important because once the podcast came out every week, we would do a Facebook Live, and that way his audience can engage with him in real time. So we would, similar to this podcast, we would live stream to his LinkedIn, to the Facebook, to the YouTube channels of Amazon Conservation Team, in addition to his personal account. So he had a very broad audience that was listening. So in the beginning, it was just him as the solo host, and then he went on to invite some of those colleagues that I talked about. And what was great was they brought their knowledge and they brought their audience. So it's building. We were building on the audience, building on the knowledge, and it was definitely less pressure on him as a host because he was co-hosting. So we did that for a while, and then the world opened up and Dr. Plotkin was out on the road again. Like many business people, he's busy, time is of the essence, and so we had to find a way to be super productive with putting the podcast together. And how we did that was that we were able to invite his guests on, spend about an hour talking to them, and then break those segments up into part 1 and part 2. So we were able to still produce our 10 episode seasons, but use our time more efficiently. So we were producing 1-hour segments, dividing them up into part 1 and part 2, and it was saving him time, but we were still getting the great value out of the podcast. So like any other business, there are principles and strategies for growth, key elements that you need to follow in order to keep your audience interested and grow them over time. As we always say, building trust and consistency is one of the great ways to start. So we were consistent over all the channels. The podcast comes out bi-weekly. It's 10 episodes per season for 6 seasons. We're in our 6th season now. We've shown up, he's shown up, and we've made it work. Driving brand recognition was also important. So we always had a clear, unified message. His topics and themes for each episode is very clear. And we promoted it beforehand so people knew what they were getting the day of the episode dropped. We're persistent as far as definitely reaching out to people, engaging with them when they engage with Dr. Plotkin, so they know that he is a part of the process. And the topics are so different and engaging. Like I said, I didn't know about some of these topics beforehand, but all of a sudden I'm hearing ayahuasca in the news, ayahuasca in modern medicine. Ayahuasca is being used to treat depression. So he's topical and informative. And those are some of the things that you need to just keep the business going, keep the podcast growing, and to keep the audience engaged. Always deep diving into interesting topics. It's been an amazing ride, and I am looking forward to continuing. If you want to hear the podcast, I suggest you go to any of your favorite podcasts, Spotify, go back to our YouTube channel and listen to them there, and you'll get caught up in everything. But Plants of the Gods, 1 million downloads. Very excited. Oh, and I remember I call him the Indiana Jones of the Amazon. I couldn't remember Indiana Jones. Oh my God, it was going out of my head.